Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with David Hoag, the new president of the CCCU, to discuss his vision for the future of Christian higher education. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of ABHE. And this is an episode that I've really been looking forward to. And we have with us David Hoag, who is the new president of CCCU. For those of you who have been around higher education, you know exactly who CCCU is. But in case you don't, it's the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. David has just recently come into the presidency following Shirley Hoogstra, who we had on our show several months back, who has retired. She's done a fantastic job there. And David has come in and I've had the opportunity to interact with him now a couple of times. And I know that you will enjoy getting to know him. He's been in Christian higher education for many years, serving a lot of that time in resource development, fundraising. Before he took the presidency of CCCU, he was at Warner University in Florida as the president. So welcome, David, to the show. Glad that you're in the seat of CCCU president.
Hey, thank you so much, Phil. Honored to be walking with you in Christian higher education and honored to be a part of today's broadcast.
Absolutely. So I just want to put a shout out there to our show sponsor, Logos Bible Software. Really appreciate them and their investment in biblical higher education as well as seminary education. So I've invited David in really for our audience to get to know you a little bit, but then also for you to share a bit about your vision for CCCU moving forward. There's so many different things that CCCU does. It's so critical for all of Christian higher education, biblical higher education. So I think it's good for us to hear what God has laid on your heart. We had a chance, went out to dinner a couple months ago, and I just loved your vision. I was like, boy, we've really got to tell this story. So we'll talk about that here in a second. Before we do that, David, talk to us about a defining moment for you in your life that kind of steered you in the direction of saying, yeah, you know what, CCCU president is something that I want to pursue?
Well, you know, where I like to start is from my own experience. And my wife and I went to Asbury College. It's Asbury University, and it's one of our CCCU schools. My wife and I were changed from that experience as faculty and staff invested in us during our academic journey. And when my wife and I were engaged and were praying about our future and what that looks like, we wanted to serve in Christian higher ed. We had no idea that would end up being 35 plus years serving at different Christian colleges and universities. And then now here at the helm at the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it's neat how God sets trajectories. And I've done a number of interviews with folks, and they reflect back off of their undergraduate experience, which is so precious for us to be involved in that work because we realize the life change that happens and it's trajectory setting, right? To have some of those experiences and the investment of faculty and staff in our lives.
Absolutely. And you know what? When I think of these foundational people that invested in us, what I want to be doing is investing in the next generation of faculty and staff on our campuses because they're the ones going to be discipling the next generation of students that are going to be leaders in our world.
Yep. And some of this is how I'm wired and getting to know you a little bit. I think you're similarly wired. We're pretty optimistic people. The privilege it is to see that next generation of leaders coming up and the passion that they have, not only for Christian higher education, but for the Lord and for seeing their students be discipled, realizing there's nothing more special than to guide a student and point them in a direction of what God has called them to do and for them to realize their gifts, talents, and abilities and to have just a small piece in launching them is such a privilege. And I think that motivates both of us to do the work that we do, right?
Absolutely. I think your college years or your years in graduate school are some of the most formational in your lives. What better place to approach and deal with real world problems and issues than places that have a biblical worldview?
Yeah.
So I just think it's so important, the work that we do at our different colleges and universities.
Love it. Love it. Well, welcome to the presidency of CCCU. Looking forward to working with you in the days to come. You have a threefold vision that you have, very clear, very articulate, coming in the door. You shared it with me when we were together. Share it with our audience. What do you see as you're assuming the presidency? What are the three areas you're going to be focusing in on?
Sure. The first one's strengthening membership. And Phil, you and I both work with an association of different colleges and universities and seminaries. It's not just about bringing in new members, but how do we come alongside of them during these very challenging times, whether it's financial, whether it's in enrollment, whether it's dealing with some other issues that might be unique to their university or college. And so that's so important. And I could give you examples of a school going through a crisis within the last week that we were able to help during a very key time. That's the first one. The second one deals with spiritual formation and then also leadership development. So think about this. We have all these young leaders that are finishing their PhDs and master's degrees, and they're going to be on their campus, and they don't necessarily know how to articulate their faith or within their discipline, or how do I disciple these students that are on these journeys? And so the spiritual formation is so important. And if you think about it, it's foundational in what we do. You and I have talked about presidential leadership. It's challenging what a president has to deal with nowadays. So this leadership development is so important. We have 150 U.S. schools, 180 worldwide, and I'm going to have 25 new presidents this year. So doing leadership development during these challenging times is so important. So we want to give them the biblical foundation, and then we want to also then help them in their leadership development. And then this third priority is advocacy. Your schools, our institutions want to be able to practice their faith and hire faculty that believe the same things that they believe, that are tied to their statement of faith. And so we have to, in a sense, get on the hill, whether it's nationally or at the state level, to make sure that our students can get the federal or state money that other schools are getting. And that's so important. And that's a full-time job right now, just with all of the changes that we have going on right now. So strengthening membership, spiritual formation, and how important, and leadership development and advocacy. Yeah. Those are our top three.
Which I love that. And that's a very clear focus for what it is, because there are so many issues that we as associations can come alongside and help with. And sometimes it's what we think our institutions need. What you've articulated there, I think, is exactly what our institutions are asking for. And I love the spiritual element to it too, recognizing that we are fundamentally different. Biblical and Christian higher education is fundamentally different than all of higher education. And you have to start there. That's your starting point, is the Word of God. And I've said it often, the Word of God has something to say about everything that we experience in life. So in our college experience, it ought to really be so pervasive that you can't separate out secular or sacred. It's all sacred because it's all God's.
There are so many things happening in the world around us, and social trends and this and that. And at institutions like ours, we're going to say, what's the Bible say about, and then you fill in the blank. And that's incredible hope for our students, for our faculty, and for the future as our graduates go out and serve.
Yeah. The advocacy piece, and we'll get to that here in another question, but I think that's such a critical one. And I think Shirley did a great job of establishing CCCU's presence in Washington, D.C., and building some of those relationships. That's such a key part. And I know from ABHE's perspective, it's not like we have anybody in Washington, D.C. And I often look to organizations like the ADF or like CCCU or even NICU or even CIC. There are a number of higher education associations that we have a dependence on because we don't have the resourcing and reach in order to have an influence in those places. We do as much as we can, but we also recognize that there are organizations that are front lines and really doing it well. And you're there in DC, and tell us a little bit about your new office space.
So I like to say I'm in Babylon, and I think our audience understands what Babylon is like. Washington, D.C. is a very, very interesting place. Mm-hmm. We're located in the Navy Yard area. I can look out my window and see the left field lights at the Washington National Stadium, and we're only a mile from the Capitol. And so we're conveniently located right here at the foot of the hill to make a difference. It's important that we're right here because we need to make sure that our different legislative leaders, congressional leaders can know that we're here and that we're wanting to be kind of this shining light, making a difference in a very challenging area.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to reorder things and just go right into this part of it. We've just experienced a whole shift politically at the federal level. And for our U.S. based institutions, whoever is the president, whoever controls the Senate, the House, Supreme Court, all of those things have significant play and impact on the ecosystem in which we operate. So we've just come through this political season here with new president. Republicans now have control of the presidency, of the House, of the Senate. We're a bit too early, but what's some of your initial take on kind of where we're at, and then what's CCCU's approach over the next couple of years?
Sure. No, thanks for asking that question. And so much chatter happening post-election right now. The nice thing, I think, Phil, that you and I would be in agreement on, our God doesn't change, regardless of who's in charge. And it's about the eternal kingdom, not about the kingdom that is going to be taking place that's inaugurated in January. I first and foremost look at this from a spiritual perspective. And so, Phil, every day that I'm here in DC and it's not raining, I do a prayer walk from my apartment. And like today, I walked around the Capitol and by the Supreme Court. And I really feel as believers, we need to put on the armor of God. So, Ephesians 6 and how important that is as we do our work right here. Now, there are so many changes going to be taking place. And even though the Republicans are going to be in charge, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be easy for us in education. What we're trying to do now as we work with our different institutions is find out who are some key individuals that can make a difference, that might be even a graduate of one of our institutions. And so, for instance, as the Secretary of Education, we don't necessarily have any influence with that new secretary, but yet we're watching to see who the undersecretary is going to be, because that's going to be a big piece there. As I look at Congress, for instance, Senator Thune now is going to be the head of the Senate. And here's a great answer to prayer. He's a Biola graduate. He's one of ours. And so we're going to build on relationships that we have with our congressional leaders. Congresswoman Fox chaired the Workforce and Education Committee. Her vacation home was 5 miles away from our campus in Florida. She won't be the chair of that committee, but it looks like a congressional leader from Utah. And we have great connections with our Latter-day Saints folks. And so we're hoping that we can be right there in those conversations. But as we look at the legislative piece, as we look at the executive branch and judicial, I like to use this term, we paint with the colors God has given us. So let's figure out the allies and individuals that we can work with. And it's about relationships. And so how can we start working with them? How can we start working with their legislative team? And that's how you start to make some difference happening. Now, I do think, and I'm going to use this comparison, as you and I deal with different groups here, it was interesting when I had conversations with those individuals that worked with, I'll call it Trump 1, and then those folks that worked with the Biden administration. With the Trump 1 administration, they were very focused on how can we kind of help you navigate. Under the Biden administration, it was a little bit more tied to regulation and a regulatory environment. Now, I don't necessarily think Trump 2 will be the same as Trump 1, in particular because there's an issue. It's called CCRA, the College Cost Reduction Act. It's a little nerve-wracking, and it can be challenging to some of our schools. And so I'm going to definitely need to make sure that I empower my U.S. presidents to work with their congressional delegations as we look at the College Cost Reduction Act, because it would actually cost our institutions $81 million a year. And we don't have those types of resources. So even though Republicans might say that they're not for big government, there's going to be some regulatory things that we're going to have to work through with this new administration.
Yeah, pause there, because I think it's important for the listeners to realize this. And I think it's probably overgeneralized, but at least in my lifetime, with the types of institutions that we serve, biblical higher education, Christian higher education, typically when a Republican president or a Republican House Senate were kind of in charge or having the majority, things were more friendly towards the things that matter to us in order to operate within our boundaries, our convictions, all those kinds of things. And when Democrats, some of the challenges came, right? That's probably overgeneralized, but I think we have to be careful because it's very clear that President-elect Trump has, he's coming after higher education in some respects in a general sense. And I think it's important that we are telling our story. We are not like the rest of higher education. And it is so important that we have strong relationships with the lawmakers, our representatives, our senators who are in DC, and at the state level, that they know who we are and what we stand for, to not paint that broad brush of all of higher education. I often say we're guilty by association because we're in the industry of higher education, but we're different than the rest.
Yeah. They're not protesting on our campuses.
Yeah.
Our students are gathering for revivals and prayer meetings and baptisms. We don't want to be lumped into what some of private higher education and higher education's been experiencing. And so I always like to encourage my presidents, tell stories. Tell stories of how God's at work on your campuses and how lives are being changed, because they are different. And I think the other thing that's very important is talking about what our alumni are doing for the common good. Many of our graduates, they're in service-related occupations. They're teachers, preachers, social work. They're serving within their communities. Our graduates have a low default rate. They're paying off their student loan. And it's just so important that we communicate who we are and what our students and our alumni are doing out in the world.
Yeah. And don't assume that those individuals who are in power know who you are. I think ignorance is probably the number one issue that we deal with. We assume that they know who we are. And I won't go into the detail of it, but there was a House passed bill a couple months ago that while it had good intent or good pieces behind it, it would have actually impacted our sector of higher education unknowingly. And until you all added language and ADF proposed adding language to it, we were able to say, hey, wait a second, understand what you're trying to do here, but realize that in the process, you're actually hurting us. A lot of times they don't even know who we are. And I think having the Senate leader being a Biola grad is huge, not only from a Christian perspective, but just from understanding higher education in general, I think is definitely a good thing.
No, I think it is so important. And that's why I would encourage your audience, your U.S. presidents, please come to DC at least once a year to start developing relationships. And don't think that it's necessarily just meeting with a congressional leader. It might be with their aide or their chief of staff, which might be the individual that's actually writing the bills that are going to be proposed. And so sometimes meeting with that level is almost more important sometimes than the photo moment and handshake with your congressman.
Yeah. There's a whole lot of mystique around it. And it's part of what I love about our type of government that we have. I think it's what makes it strong is you have, as a citizen of the United States, you have a representative in DC. They have every reason And they do. It's amazing the access that you have. And sometimes I think we think, oh, well, we can't talk to a senator, we can't talk to a representative. They open the door.
You're right. They open the door. So the other thing that folks need to realize, sometimes even visiting with them back in their home state might even be a better opportunity than seeing them up on the Hill, because sometimes they're very busy. They're in session. There's committee meetings. So again, I encourage our listeners, invite them to your campus. Let them interact with your faculty and staff, regardless of their political party. I think it's so important that you develop those relationships.
Barry Corey tells a great story, president of Biola, tells a great story about that. Even if ideologically or politically your representative or your senator thinks differently than you do or your institution, still reach out and build the relationship, because he tells the story of, why do you only come when you need something? Build a relationship, even though you disagree. And boy, it's all about relationships. And in the process, we have the opportunity to show the love of Christ in building that relationship.
Absolutely. I had an interesting time. Our congressional leader, he was very LGBTQ oriented. We had developed a good enough relationship, and I was in his office and I said, we agree on many things, but where we probably disagree is on human sexuality. And as I explained it to him, he paused and said this to me, maybe in a simplistic term. He said, so David, you don't want heterosexual students to have sex on your campus, or any homosexual students to have sex on your campus? And I said, exactly. He said, well, I'm okay with that because you're not discriminating against anybody. Sometimes it's just hard for them to understand our biblical view on human sexuality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's where that relationship comes in. You and I have talked about this too, and it's kind of related to your first point. A lot of transition in higher education, biblical higher education, Christian higher education. We have financial issues at our institutions, mergers, acquisitions happening, closures happening. You've been in the industry for over 3 decades, so I think you have some chops to be able to think about this. As you vision the future, 10, 15 years, even beyond our presidencies within the organizations that we serve, where do you see higher education? If you had that crystal ball moment to say, this is what it's going to look like.
It's changing, and it changes all the time. Technology, artificial intelligence, politics. But again, and I said this earlier, what's so important is God's not changing. Even though things are changing within society, we need to make sure that we're staying focused on our mission and the world in what we do. And you said it correctly, we're losing some institutions. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in this initiative of strengthening membership is creating opportunities for like-minded institutions to collaborate, maybe at a whole nother level. This past weekend, I was meeting with a group of denominational presidents, just having the conversation about what that might look like if they did things together. So imagine this. They all have the same statement of faith. What if they started working on some of their back office operations and collaborating together? So think about the finance piece. Think about your campus management system or your learning management system. What if across your denomination, a student could take a course offered at an institution that might not necessarily be the one that they're residentially at, but yet what you're trying to do is open opportunities, but also make education much more affordable. And, I think we are going to see more and more schools merge. And I do think geography is going to start to play in this. And you may wonder, what does geography and how does that mean? You have this enrollment cliff. The number of graduates in some of our states is going down drastically. But yet there are other states that might be I'm coming from Florida, where the number of graduates are going up 14.7% over the next 5 years. That's a lot. That's a big number. But yet schools up in the Midwest, their numbers are declining. Institutions that are located in areas that are declining, they're going to need to start collaborating more with others, or their recruitment strategies as to where they go get their students is going to need to be a little bit different, because the funnel of students from their own territory is going to continue to go down. I think, Phil, you're going to also see dual enrollment increasing quite a bit. And, it's my hope that we can get our Christian K-12s doing more dual enrollment with our Christian institutions and have partnerships there. Because think about this. Imagine having a year or two under your belt as you're getting started in college. It's going to make college much more affordable and make it so that families can make it work, because families haven't necessarily prepared for college and that financial burden that's going to be there. But it's my hope that we can continue to make strides on several of these different areas as we move forward.
Yeah. And you and I have talked about this before, that oftentimes when colleges are facing difficulties, financial difficulties, considerations of closures or mergers, those conversations are happening 5 years later than they should have. And we're just in a different day. And from a sustainability perspective, it's just so important for institutions to think about how can we be better with partnerships with who we thought would be competition. The business sector has figured this out. You're seeing business competitors joining together because they realize that even though we're competing on certain things, there's other things that we're not, and we can actually approach this together. And some of those conversations, I mean, that's to me low-hanging fruit. A denominational set of schools sharing back office efficiencies. It just makes sense. There's no reason why that has to be so siloed.
Yeah. One of the things I'm working on, Phil, is this dashboard of indicators. And so, like, for instance, we've just studied the last 6 schools that closed. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to look at what are some indicators or things that they were struggling with to kind of show some of our boards. If you're seeing some of these indicators, could be declining enrollments, could be increased endowment spending, could be growing deferred maintenance, and the list can go on and on and on. And so I want to be able to empower our boards and our presidents to see, well, these are some things we're struggling with. You said it key. It's important for schools to recognize things earlier than at the end, because I really think that we've lost some schools because they didn't act soon enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's tough. You're living with not the pressure, but the realization of an entire history of an institution and the impact that they've had. And you don't want the lights to go out, and you want to try every last ditch effort. But sometimes there's the need to look at some objective data to say, oh boy, there are some signals here that we've got to do something differently. Both you and I are committed to that and helping our institutions see that before it's too late, so that they can actually make some legitimate course corrections that will make them sustainable in the future. So, well, listen, we have 1 minute left. You have, like I said before, over 3 decades. I won't even go further than that. Maybe it's 4 decades. I don't know.
No, it's just 3, thank goodness. But I've got a lot of gray hair.
Yeah, 3 point something though.
3 point something.
We have a lot of young listeners who are early on in their leadership careers. What's one word of advice that you would give to them as they progress on their leadership journey?
Get involved, be active, get a mentor, get in a small group. It's no different than growing from a discipleship perspective. Ask someone that's in the field to mentor you, because people are willing to pour their lives into you as you're on your own journey. So get involved and network.
Absolutely. Great word of advice. David, this was fantastic. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and experiences with us today.
Well, honored to be able to serve. And Phil, I look forward to partnering with you more in the future, because we both are doing the same thing with the similar institutions.
We are. Absolutely. And if you'd like more information about CCCU, in the show description, we'll make sure that we put a link there. And again, a special shout out to Logos Bible Software. We so appreciate their partnership, long-standing partnership with ABHE, and their financial support of this particular episode. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.